cold came without warning that night. It swept through the narrow alleys of Dunmore like a living thing, curling beneath door frames, pressing against shuttered windows, climbing inside the worn wool cloaks of those foolish enough to still be wandering the streets after the lanterns burned low. Most people were already home, already safe. Ella was not most people. She had been cutting through the back lane behind the tanner's workshop, the shortcut she always used after her long hours in the healer's cottage, when she heard it. Not a scream, not a shout. Something quieter, and for that reason, far more alarming. A sharp exhale, a body hitting stone. Ella stopped walking. The alley ahead was dark, lit only by the pale strip of moonlight that managed to squeeze between the rooftops. She should have kept moving. Every sensible part of her said exactly that. Keep walking, Ella. Lower your eyes. It is none of your concern. Instead, she turned. There were 3 of them, large men, cloaked in dark wool, their faces half hidden beneath low hoods. They stood in a loose circle around a 4th figure. A man on one knee in the mud, one hand braced against the alley wall. Even kneeling, even still, there was something about the breadth of his shoulders, the deliberate way he held his head, that made Ella's breath catch. He was bleeding. She could smell it from where she stood. Copper and iron, sharp against the night air. One of the hooded men said something low, something she couldn't hear. Then he drew a short blade. Ella did not think. She had learned long ago that thinking came second in moments like these. Her hands moved before her mind could stop them. She grabbed the clay pot sitting forgotten on the workshop's outer ledge, heavy, filled with cold ash, and threw it. It struck the man with the blade square in the back of the head. The crack echoed like a thunderclap. All 3 men spun toward her. For one terrible second, nobody moved. The alley was silent except for the distant bark of a dog somewhere across the village and the faint drip of water from a broken gutter above. Then Ella screamed, not in fear but deliberately at the top of her voice. "Guards! Here! There are men in the alley!" She had no idea if there were guards anywhere nearby. In a place like Dunmore, a border village clinging to the edge of the kingdom, guards were a generous word for 3 men who mostly sat near the gatehouse and argued over dice. But the hooded men did not know that. They ran. The sound of their boots against wet stone faded quickly into the dark. Then silence returned, heavy, breathless, smelling of mud and ash and blood. Ella pressed her back against the wall for a moment, her heart hammering so hard she could feel it in her throat. Then she pushed off and walked toward the kneeling man. Up close, he was large. Even crouched, she could see that he would tower over her when standing. His cloak was dark, fine wool, the kind with a border of embroidered thread that cost more than she earned in 3 months. His dark hair was pushed back from his face, damp from the cold mist, and when he lifted his head to look at her, his eyes were unexpected. Gray. Not dull gray, but the gray of a winter sky, just before a storm breaks, when all the light concentrates in a single stripe along the horizon. He was looking at her the way no one in Dunmore had ever looked at Ella, like she was something he had not anticipated. "You threw a pot at him," he said. His voice was low and even, like he was commenting on weather. It was the heaviest thing nearby. She crouched in front of him, already pulling at the laces of the small leather satchel she always carried. Inside, strips of clean linen, dried yarrow, a vial of elderflower tincture, a small bone needle already threaded from that afternoon's work. "Let me see your side." "I am fine." "You are kneeling in an alley at midnight and bleeding through your cloak." She met his gaze steadily. "You are not fine. Let me see it." Something passed across his face, not offense, not amusement exactly. Something harder to name, as if no one had spoken to him so directly in a very long time. and the sound of it had surprised something awake inside him. He moved his cloak aside without another word. The cut was long, but not deep. A blade had caught him along the ribs, slicing through the fine linen of his undershirt. Ella worked quietly, efficiently, the way she always did. She cleaned the wound with the tincture, pressed yarrow to slow the bleeding, and began to bind the linen strips tight. Her fingers were cold, but they were steady. They were always steady. "You are a healer," he said. "Apprentice healer." She tied the last knot. "Hold this firm for a moment." He pressed his hand over the binding without question. She sat back on her heels and studied his face again, really looked, now that the immediate work was done. He was not old. Perhaps 30, perhaps a little beyond. A shadow of beard along a strong jaw. A scar, thin and old, crossing the edge of his chin. And those eyes, still watching her with that unreadable attention. "You should not have stayed," he said quietly. "Those men could have turned on you." "They could have." She began repacking her satchel. "But they did not." "You could not have known they would run." "No," she agreed. "I could not have." He was quiet for a moment. "That does not seem to trouble you?" Ella stood, satchel over her shoulder, and looked down at him. He was still on one knee, which made the eye contact oddly equal, and she wondered if he was aware of that. "What troubles me," she said plainly, "is leaving a bleeding man alone in an alley." She offered her hand, not gracefully, not theatrically, just straightforwardly, the way she would to anyone. "Can you stand?" He looked at her offered hand for one long, unreadable moment. Then he took it. He was steady on his feet once upright, though she could feel the slight tension in his grip that told her the ribs hurt more than he would admit. He released her hand and stepped back, and yes, he was tall, significantly taller than she was. The moonlight caught the embroidered border of his cloak again, and something about the pattern made the back of her mind stir, with a vague recognition she couldn't quite place. "Where are you headed?" she asked. "The gatehouse." A pause. "I was separated from my escort." Escort. She looked at him again. The fine cloak. The quality of his boots. Leather and buckled, not rope-tied. The way he stood, even wounded, with a stillness that felt less like peace and more like contained force. "The gatehouse is west," she said carefully. "Past the mill." "I know." "Then you do not need me to show you." "No." Another pause. Wind moved through the alley, carrying the smell of pine from the forest beyond the village wall. Somewhere in the direction of the gatehouse, she thought she could hear, faintly, the sound of horses. "Thank you," the man said. The words were quiet, simple. But something in the way he said them, like they cost him something, like they were not a thing he gave easily, made Ella's chest pull in a strange way. She nodded. "Keep the binding dry for 2 days. Change it tomorrow evening. The yarrow will do its work." She turned to go. "What is your name?" She stopped, looked back over her shoulder. "Ella." He said nothing else. She walked away, her boots finding the familiar stones of Dunmore's narrow lanes, her breath clouding in the cold air, the sound of those distant horses growing louder. She did not sleep well that night. Not because she was afraid, because she kept seeing those gray eyes in the dark, steady and unreadable, watching her like she was something he had not anticipated. She told herself it meant nothing. She told herself she would never see him again. In the pale gray light of the next morning, when the sound of 100 horses and the royal banner of the Alpha King of Eldenmore swept into Dunmore's square, Ella understood how wrong she had been, because standing at the center of that arriving procession, taller than his guard, still and composed under the cold winter sun, his dark hair pushed back from a face she recognized entirely, was the man from the alley. And he was already looking directly at her. Palabras. 1. 487. Completando ate 1. 800. The banner above him was unmistakable, deep midnight blue and silver, the great wolf of Eldenmore embroidered at its center, teeth not bared but jaw set, the posture of something that had nothing to prove. Ella had seen that banner painted above the village hall since she was a child. She had grown up knowing what it meant. She had simply never imagined that she would one day be standing in a muddy square, a satchel of herbs on her shoulder, staring up at the man it represented. His escort was large, 40 riders at least, armored in dark plate with the same silver wolf at the chest. Behind them came a second group, less armored, clearly officials and advisors. And behind those, 4 great wagons, canvas covered against the morning chill. Dunmore's headman was already rushing forward from the crowd, bowing deeply, words tumbling out of him in a flood of welcome and deference. But Aiden, King Aiden of Eldenmore, Alpha King of the Northern Reaches, ruler of a territory so vast that Dunmore was barely a mark on its edge, was not looking at the headman. He was looking at Ella. Not the way powerful men usually looked at village women, over them, through them, past them. He was looking at her the way he had looked at her in the alley. Direct. Quiet. Like she was the only thing in the square that had already earned his complete attention, and he had simply come to finish a conversation she hadn't known they were having. She felt her heart do something complicated and unhelpful. His gray eyes held hers for exactly 3 seconds. Then he looked away, turned to the headman with an expression that was composed and appropriate, and the business of the royal visit began. Around Ella, the village woke up fast. People pressed close, craning their necks, murmuring. Children climbed onto fence rails. The baker's wife beside her grabbed her arm without looking, too busy staring at the procession to notice who she was clutching. Ella stood very still. She was thinking about what he had said in the alley, separated from my escort, and understanding now exactly how enormous an understatement that had been. She was thinking about 3 cloaked men with a blade, kneeling in the dark and blood-wet mud, and what that might have meant for an entire kingdom if she had simply kept walking. She was thinking about how he had taken her hand without hesitation, and she was thinking about the fact that the Alpha King of Eldenmore had just arrived in the smallest village of his territory, the morning after a healer's apprentice with cold hands and a stolen clay pot had kept him alive in an alley. He had not pretended to forget. She understood that now, with the kind of certainty that settles in the body before the mind has caught up. He had come here knowing she was here. He had ridden with 40 guards and official banners into a village that barely warranted a courier. And he had looked for her first, before he had looked at anything else. The question was why. The question she was beginning to suspect was going to change everything. The healer's cottage sat at the edge of Dunmore like an afterthought, small, stone-walled, its roof patched twice over with different shades of thatch that never quite matched. Inside, it smelled of dried lavender, beeswax, and the faint mineral sharpness of yarrow left too long in an iron pot. Ella had spent 4 years within those walls, learning the difference between a fever that would break and one that would not, memorizing the weight of a proper poultice, practicing stitches on cured leather until her hands knew the motion without needing her eyes. She loved the cottage. It was the one place in Dunmore where she felt entirely competent, entirely herself. She was trying very hard to feel that way now, and failing. The knock at the door came 2 hours after the royal procession had settled into the village square. She had spent those 2 hours pretending to organize her herb jars, moving them from one shelf to another and back again with no real purpose, her hands needing something to do while her mind kept returning, against her will, to gray eyes in the dark. When the knock came, she straightened, pressed her palms flat against her apron, and opened the door. It was not the king. It was a guard, tall, armored in dark plate, the silver wolf gleaming at his chest. He had a square face, a carefully neutral expression, and the posture of someone who had delivered royal summons long enough to consider it entirely unremarkable. Ella of Dunmore, he said. The king requests your presence at the headman's hall. She had expected this, in the vague way one expects a storm after watching the sky go green. She had still hoped to be wrong. He requests, she said, or he commands. The guard blinked, very slightly. He requests, my lady. My lady. She was the daughter of a miller's widow and a man who had left when Ella was 6. The title fit like a boot on the wrong foot. Give me a moment, she said, and closed the door. She stood in the middle of the cottage for 3 full breaths. Then she untied her working apron, hung it on its hook, smoothed her dress, dark blue wool, well made if simple her best, and opened the door again. The headman's hall was the largest building in Dunmore, which was not saying much. It had a long oak table down its center, a fire pit at one end that today was actually burning properly, and walls hung with old tapestries depicting hunting scenes so faded that the animals were barely visible anymore. The hall smelled of wood smoke and the mutton stew someone had hastily put on when the royal party arrived. Aidan was standing near the fire when she entered. He was not sitting at the table like a man holding court. He was standing to the side of it, slightly apart from the 2 advisors who hovered nearby with the anxious energy of men who had learned that hovering was expected of them. He had changed from his riding clothes, or had his things brought from the wagons, and wore dark wool and leather now, clean and fitted, a simple clasp at his collar shaped like the wolf. No crown. She wasn't sure if she had expected one. He looked up when she entered. The advisors looked at her too, with expressions she recognized, the particular combination of surprise and dismissal that said village girl, no one important. She had worn that look her whole life, like a second cloak. She was used to it. Aidan's expression was neither of those things. It was the same careful attention from the alley, now in daylight, without mud or blood or darkness to soften it. Leave us, he said. The advisors exchanged a glance. One of them, older, thin-faced, wearing rings on every finger, said, with great delicacy, Your Majesty, protocol suggests... I am aware of what protocol suggests. His voice did not rise. It simply settled, the way a stone settles when dropped into still water, decisive, without drama. Leave us. They left. The guard who had escorted Ella positioned himself outside the closed door. The hall was quiet now, except for the fire. Ella stood near the entrance. She was not going to walk toward him first. That felt important, though she couldn't fully explain why. You did not tell anyone, he said. I beg your pardon? Last night. He watched her carefully. You did not tell anyone in this village what you saw in that alley. She considered this. He was right. She had said nothing, not because she had made a deliberate decision, but because she had come home, climbed into her narrow bed, and lain awake staring at the ceiling. There had been no one to tell. There was rarely anyone to tell things to in Ella's life. I did not know what I had seen, she said honestly, not entirely. And now? Now I know you are the king. She paused. Which means those men were trying to kill you. Yes. And they failed. Partly because of a clay pot and a great deal of noise. The corner of his mouth moved. It was not quite a smile. It was something more restrained than that, like the beginning of one that had been interrupted by habit. Sit down, Ella. I am comfortable standing. He looked at her for a moment. Then he pulled out the chair nearest her, not for himself, but deliberately, placing it within easy reach. An offer, not a command. She sat. He remained standing, which should have felt like a power arrangement, and somehow did not. He moved to the edge of the table, rested one hand on it, and was quiet for a moment in the way of someone who had made decisions about what to say, and was now reconsidering them. The men who attacked me last night were not bandits, he said finally. I assumed not. They were hired. I do not yet know by whom. His jaw tightened, barely perceptibly. My escort was separated from me by design. There was a disturbance at the north gate while I was still outside the village walls. By the time I understood what was happening, I was alone in the alley. A pause. If you had not been passing. Ella folded her hands in her lap. Then it is fortunate I take the back lane. Fortunate, he repeated, like he was testing the weight of the word. Yes. He looked at her steadily. You did not hesitate. Hesitating would not have helped. Most people hesitate, even trained soldiers when faced with an unexpected threat. He studied her face. You grabbed a pot of ash and threw it at a man with a blade. I knew I couldn't fight them, she said simply, but I knew I could be loud. Something in his expression shifted, not dramatically, but perceptibly, like a door that had been pulled slightly more open. I have come to Dunmore for a reason, he said. The royal progress was planned months ago. We are inspecting border villages, supply lines, defenses, conditions of the people. He moved away from the table, toward the fire, and Ella turned slightly to track him. But I have also come because I intended to find you. The fire popped. A log shifted, sending a brief shower of sparks up into the dark mouth of the chimney. Why? She asked. Because you did something that very few people in my life have ever done. He turned to face her across the length of the hall, and in the firelight, his gray eyes were warmer than they had been in the cold dark of the alley. You helped me without asking what you would receive in return. Ella was quiet for a moment. I did not help you because I expected something. I know. He held her gaze. That is exactly why I am here. She was not certain what to do with that. It sat in the air between them with a weight she could not quite measure. What is it you want from me? She asked, directly. The way she spoke to everyone. She had no other way. He was quiet for longer than she expected. My healer died 3 weeks ago, he said. Fever. It was fast. A pause. Brief, but with something underneath it. My people have healers stationed through the territory, but none with formal training willing to travel north to the capital for a full season. He let the statement settle. I have been told you are the most skilled apprentice Dunmore has produced in 20 years. She felt the ground shift slightly beneath the conversation, the beginning of understanding where this was going. Master Corwin said that? Master Corwin wrote it in a letter of record 3 years ago. My steward found it while searching the census rolls last night when I sent word of who you were. He watched her. You have been healing alone for 2 months, since Master Corwin passed. She had not expected him to know that. The knowledge that he had investigated her, quickly, efficiently, before sunrise, should have been unsettling. Instead, it felt strangely like being seen. I am an apprentice, she said carefully, not a full healer. You bound my ribs in a dark alley with cold hands and no proper light, and the binding has held all morning. He glanced down briefly, then back up. I am not concerned about the title. She looked at the fire for a moment, then back at him. You want me to come to the capital? She said. I want to offer you the position, he said. The choice is yours. She heard the distinction. She thought he meant for her to hear it. I would need to know more before I could answer. Then ask. She looked at him, really looked, the way she had in the alley, with the same practical attention she brought to diagnosing a wound. He was watching her with complete seriousness. No flattery, no performance. A king who had ridden into a border village and sat in a headman's hall and said the choice is yours, like he meant every syllable. The question she had woken up with that morning, why did he not pretend to forget, was beginning quietly to answer itself. How long? She said. 1 full season, with the option to return hereafter. No conditions. She was quiet. "And if I say no?" "Then I thank you again for the alley," he said, "and we do not speak of it further." The fire burned. Outside, she could hear the distant sounds of the village adjusting itself around the presence of the royal court. Boots on cobblestone, voices, the whinny of horses. Ella thought about the cottage, the jars she kept rearranging, the bed she lay awake in. She thought about gray eyes that had looked at her first. "I will give you my answer tomorrow," she said. He nodded once. "Tomorrow. Then." She stood, and this time she was the one who left first. Walking back through the hall, back into the cold morning air. Her heart was not hammering now. It was doing something steadier and more complicated than that. She was already thinking about what she would pack. Eldenmore's capital was called Veyrath. Ella had heard the name her entire life the way one hears the name of a distant mountain. Something real and permanent, and entirely removed from daily existence. A place that existed in the kingdom's tax records, in the songs merchants carried through Dunmore, in the hushed tones of people who had never been there but spoke of it with the particular authority of those who had imagined it thoroughly. Nothing she had imagined had prepared her for the reality of it. They had ridden for 4 days, she and the royal party, moving north along the stone road that cut through pine forests, thick enough to block the midday sun. The cold deepened as they traveled, pressing down from the mountains that ringed the northern reaches like a crown of gray stone. The other riders were courteous to her in the careful, distant way of people who had been instructed to be courteous and were following instructions. The king rode at the head of the procession each day, and did not speak to her directly again until the morning of the 4th day, when he slowed his horse to ride briefly beside her and asked without preamble whether the pace was manageable. She had said yes, truthfully. He had nodded and ridden forward again. It was not much. She told herself it was not much. Veyrath appeared first as smoke, dozens of cooking fires and forge chimneys sending thin columns into the white winter sky. Then the outer wall came into view. Dark stone, older than anything Ella had ever seen, stretching across the landscape with the quiet confidence of something that had survived centuries and expected to survive several more. The great gates were open, iron and oak, 3 times the height of a man. And as the procession passed beneath them, Ella felt the shadow of the stone arch fall across her like a physical thing. Inside the walls, the city unfolded in layers. A lower market district first, loud with voices and the smell of horse and bread and tallow candles. Then a middle quarter of guild halls and merchant houses, their carved wooden signs swinging in the wind. And above all of it, on the long rise of the hill at the city's heart, the castle. It was not beautiful the way tapestries made castles beautiful, all delicate towers and romantic silhouettes. It was something more serious than beautiful. It was enormous and deliberate, built from the same dark stone as the wall, its towers broad and practical, its battlements worn smooth by weather. It looked like a thing that had been built to last, not to impress, and had ended up impressive anyway. Ella rode through the castle gates with her chin up and her hands steady on the reins, and her stomach a complicated knot of things she refused to name. Her quarters were better than she had expected, and worse than she had feared. A room on the 3rd floor of the east wing, stone walls hung with tapestries in deep green and brown, a narrow window that looked out over the inner courtyard, a bed with a proper frame and 2 wool blankets, a writing desk, a shelf already stocked with common medicinal herbs, though poorly organized. Someone had alphabetized them, which was not how a working healer organized anything. She spent the first hour reorganizing the shelf by use and urgency, because it was something to do with her hands. A woman came to find her as she was finishing, perhaps 40 years old, with a broad, weathered face and dark hair streaked through with gray, pulled back tightly beneath a linen coif. She introduced herself as Marin, the head of household staff, and delivered this information with the brisk efficiency of someone who considered pleasantries a minor inefficiency. "You will have full access to the healing chambers on the ground floor," Marin said, moving through the room with the critical eye of someone conducting an inspection. The kitchen will send meals here unless you indicate otherwise. You are permitted in all common areas of the castle and the inner courtyard. The king's private wing is above the Great Hall. You do not go there unless called. Understood, Ella said. Marin stopped and looked at her directly for the first time. Her eyes were sharp and dark, and they moved over Ella with the frank assessment of someone who had seen many people come through this castle and had formed reliable opinions about most of them. You are young, she said. I am 23. For this position. I have been told I am capable for this position. Marin's expression did not change exactly, but something in it settled. The faintest shift of someone who had asked a question indirectly and received a satisfactory answer. I will send someone with your evening meal, she said, and left. Ella turned back to the herb shelf. She moved the dried rosemary 3 inches to the left and then stood very still for a moment, her hand resting on the cool stone of the shelf. Listening to the unfamiliar sounds of Veyrath Castle, distant footsteps, the wind in the courtyard, the deep resonant toll of a bell somewhere in one of the towers. She was here. She had actually come. She thought about Dunmore, the smell of the healer's cottage, the familiar weight of the lanes underfoot, the way the whole village knew her name in the small, circumscribed way that villages know everyone's name. She thought about the alley, and the gray eyes, and the words, "The choice is yours." She pressed her palm flat against the stone shelf and felt its cold steadiness move up through her arm. Forward, then, she thought. She met Lord Cedric on her 3rd morning at court. She had been crossing the Great Hall, cutting through on her way to the healing chambers, her satchel on her shoulder, a list of supplies she needed to request already forming in her mind, when a voice stopped her. You must be the village healer. She turned. He was standing near the hall's long side table, a cup in his hand, dressed in deep burgundy wool, with silver thread at the cuffs. He was perhaps 50, or preserved well enough that 50 was a guess. His hair was silver, his face handsome in the architectural way of men who had always known they were handsome, and had organized their personalities accordingly. His eyes were pale blue and very sharp, and they were moving over her with an appraisal that she recognized and did not particularly enjoy. Apprentice healer, she said. Ella of Dunmore. Lord Cedric Vane, he said, inclining his head with the precision of a man who calculated every gesture. The king's chief advisor. A pause, waited. I was not consulted on your appointment. I would imagine many things happen without consulting you, she said pleasantly. Something flickered behind his pale eyes. You are forthright. I find it saves time. He studied her for a moment, cup still in hand, expression calibrated somewhere between amusement and assessment. The king rarely makes unilateral decisions of this nature, he said. Bringing an untested village girl to court without discussion. It is unusual. Perhaps his circumstances were unusual. Yes, he tilted his head slightly. His circumstances. Another pause. Tell me, Ella of Dunmore, how exactly did you come to meet the king? She held his gaze. Through my work. It was not a lie. It was simply not the whole truth. She watched him process that, and she watched him decide, for now, not to push further. But she could see it in the careful stillness of his expression. He already knew there was more, and he had simply decided to retrieve it another way. Welcome to Veyrath, he said, raising his cup briefly. I hope you find it instructive. He walked away. Ella stood in the middle of the great hall for a moment, her hand wrapped around her satchel strap, watching him go. She did not like Lord Cedric Vane. She did not know yet exactly why, beyond the obvious performance of his condescension. But something underneath that, some quality in the calculation of his pauses, the precision of his questions, sat at the back of her mind like a splinter she couldn't quite locate, It was on the 5th evening that she saw Aiden again in any real way. She had been summoned to the healing chambers to examine one of the younger stable hands, a boy of perhaps 15 who had taken a bad fall from a horse and bruised 2 ribs. She had examined him, bound the ribs competently, told him firmly that he was not to ride for 2 weeks, and listened to his protests with the patient expression she had developed for exactly this kind of protest. She was washing her hands in the basin near the chamber door when she heard boots in the corridor. A particular, even rhythm that she recognized without understanding how she already recognized it. Aiden appeared in the doorway. He was alone, which surprised her. No guard, no advisor, no trail of attendants. He wore simple dark clothes. Not the formal dress of court, but something more like what he had worn in the alley, fitted and functional, as if he had come from somewhere he had not needed to perform anything. He looked at the stable boy first, who immediately sat up straight and went pale with something between awe and terror, and then at Ella. 2 bruised ribs, she said, before he could speak. He will be well. 2 weeks' rest. I told the healer I could ride by, the boy began. 2 weeks, Ella said, without looking away from Aiden. Aiden looked at the boy. 2 weeks, he agreed. The boy closed his mouth. Aiden stepped back from the doorway, and after a moment Ella dried her hands and followed him into the corridor. He closed the chamber door behind her. The corridor was dim, lit by 2 wall torches that guttered slightly in the draft from the courtyard. "You have settled in," he said. It was not quite a question. "I have reorganized the herb shelf," she said. "That is a beginning." His mouth moved with that same, almost not quite expression from the alley. She was beginning to think it was the closest thing he had to an easy smile, something he was out of practice with, like a word in a language he had once known well. "Marin tells me you are capable," he said. "Did you ask her?" A pause. "Yes." She looked at him steadily. "And Lord Cedric tells me you rarely make appointments without consulting him." Something shifted in his expression, sharper, briefly. "Cedric spoke to you. 3rd morning, Great Hall." She kept her voice neutral. "He was curious about the nature of my appointment." "What did you tell him?" "That I came through my work." She paused, "Which is true." He was quiet for a moment, and in that quiet she had the sense of something moving behind his gray eyes. Calculation that was not cold, exactly, but was entirely serious. "Cedric is my advisor," he said carefully. "He has been in that position for 11 years. He is effective, and he is territorial about information. I noticed the territorial part. Be careful with him." The words were quiet and direct, with no performance around them. Not a command, more like something he was saying because he considered her worth the warning. Ella looked at him for a long moment. In the uneven torchlight, with no crown and no court around him, he looked less like a king and more like what she suspected he actually was, a man carrying a great deal of weight in the careful stillness of his posture. "I am usually careful," she said, "with things that need it." He held her gaze. "I know," he said. "That is not what concerns me." She felt that sentence land somewhere deeper than its words. "What does concern you?" she asked. He opened his mouth. Then something closed in his expression. Not coldly, but with the practiced restraint of someone who had learned that certain doors, once opened, could not be easily managed again. "Rest," he said instead. "The first full court day is tomorrow. It will be long." He turned and walked back toward the main corridor. She watched him go, the torchlight moving across the dark of his cloak. The splinter feeling from Lord Cedric's smile was still there, but now beside it was something different, something quieter and less comfortable and more complicated. She stood in the corridor for another moment, listening to the castle settle around her in the dark. She had been here 5 days. She was already certain that the most dangerous things in Veyrath Castle were not going to declare themselves openly. Winter deepened around Veyrath like a hand slowly closing. The courtyard stones grew slick with frost each morning, and the castle's corridors held a cold that no amount of wall torches could entirely reach. A bone-deep chill that settled into the stone itself and radiated outward through every surface. Ella learned to wear 2 layers beneath her dress on healing chamber days, and to keep a small clay brazier burning near her work table. She learned that the kitchen would send warm broth without being asked if she mentioned having a long morning ahead. She learned the names of the castle's people one by one. The stable master Bram, whose hands were permanently calloused, and who spoke to horses more gently than to anyone else. The young kitchen apprentice Wren, gap-toothed and quick-eyed, who brought Ella's meals and stayed to talk longer than strictly necessary. The 4 castle guards who rotated through the East Wing corridor and had developed a habit of nodding to her with the particular respect people give to healers, a recognition that you are someone who has seen them vulnerable. She was building a life, piece by careful piece, in a place that was not hers. She told herself this was what she had come to do. She did not let herself examine too closely what else she was doing. Aiden came to the healing chambers 11 days after her arrival, not as a visitor but as a patient, which he announced by walking through the door at an hour when she was alone, without sending word ahead, and sitting down on the examination bench with the expression of a man who had delayed this longer than was medically advisable. "You're binding," she said, before he could say anything. "It has been 2 weeks. It has been 17 days, and you have been in the training yard every morning for the last 4. She had heard it from Bram, who mentioned it the way one mentions weather, as simple fact. "Let me see." He removed his outer layer without argument, and she unwound the old linen with efficient hands. The wound had healed cleanly. The yarrow had done its work, and whoever he was as a king, he was physically resilient in the particular way of men who had been active all their lives. The ribs beneath showed only the fading yellow-green of old bruising. "Clean," she said. "You can leave the binding off now." "Good." He made no move to put his shirt back on immediately, which gave her a professional problem. She needed to apply a final wash of tincture to the healed skin, and this required proximity, and she had become inconveniently aware of proximity where he was concerned. She was a healer. She handled proximity practically, the way she handled everything. She applied the tincture, noted clinically that the work had held well, and stepped back. "You have been spending time with Marin," he said. "She knows this castle better than anyone." Ella began repacking her kit. "She is also cleverer than she lets people believe, which I respect. She told me you have been visiting the lower town." Ella paused. "Is that not permitted?" "It is permitted." He watched her. "It is simply unusual for someone in your position to choose to spend their free hours in the market quarter rather than the upper halls. The upper halls have enough people attending them." She closed her satchel. "The lower town has families with children who cannot easily access the castle's healing chambers. I went twice. I am hoping to arrange a regular day." He was quiet for a moment. Not the thoughtful pause quiet, but the kind that meant something had shifted slightly in how he was processing a situation. "Talk to Marin about supplies," he said. "Whatever you need for those visits will be provided." She looked at him. "You are not going to debate the appropriateness of it?" "Should I?" "Lord Cedric would." "Lord Cedric is not here." A pause. "And his opinion on how a healer spends her time is not the one that matters." She held his gaze for a moment. Then she nodded, picked up her satchel and said, "Your ribs are healed. Try not to take any more blades to them." "I will take the advice under consideration." She was at the door when he said quietly, "Ella." She turned. He was looking at her with that measured attention that she had stopped trying to interpret and had simply learned to receive. "Thank you," he said. "For the lower town visits. The people of Veyrath. They matter to me." She understood, in the way she sometimes understood things before she had the words for them, that this was not a polite thing to say. It was a true thing, spoken plainly, the way he seemed to speak everything, without the decorative casing that most people in this castle wrapped their words in. "I know," she said simply, and left. The threat made itself known on a Tuesday, in the gray mid-morning hour between the breakfast service and the first court session. Ella was crossing the inner courtyard when she saw Lord Cedric near the East Passage, not unusual in itself, except that he was in conversation with a man she did not recognize. The stranger was lean, dark-cloaked, with the kind of face that her mind slid off without finding purchase. Unremarkable by design, she thought. The kind of unremarkable that was its own disguise. She would not have stopped. She was not in the habit of observing other people's conversations. But the stranger turned his head as she passed, and for a fraction of a second, their eyes met. And something in the flat, calculating quality of his gaze made her step falter. She kept walking. She did not look back. In the healing chamber, she sat down at her work table and made herself be still, the way she made herself be still when a patient's condition was worse than expected and panic would not help. She went back through the detail of what she had seen: Cedric, the courtyard, the lean stranger, the calculating gaze. And then, with the slow, terrible clarity of something surfacing from deep water, she recognized something. The stranger's hands. She had noticed his hands in the moment their eyes met. The way one notices small things when something larger has triggered alarm. Long-fingered, the left one bearing a thin scar along the outer edge. She had seen that scar before. In an alley in Dunmore, on a man holding a short blade. She went to Marin, not to Aiden. Not immediately, not directly, because she did not yet know what she had or whether what she thought she had was real. She found Marin in the linen storage room off the main corridor and said, with the same calm she used for complicated diagnoses, "I need to ask you something about Lord Cedric." Marin set down the linen she was folding. She looked at Ella with those dark, sharp eyes. "Ask," she said. "Who are his known associates outside the castle? The ones who come and go without formal announcement?" Marin was quiet for a long moment. It was not the quiet of someone who didn't know. It was the quiet of someone deciding what to do with the fact that someone was asking. "You have seen something," Marin said. Not a question. "I think so. I am not certain enough to go further with it yet." Marin looked at her steadily. Then she turned and pulled something from the shelf behind her. A small folded document, the kind used for internal household records. She held it for a moment. "There is a man," she said quietly, "who visits Lord Cedric 3 or 4 times a year. He is registered in the gate records as a wool merchant from the southern provinces." She held Ella's gaze. "He is not a wool merchant." "How do you know?" "Because I have been keeping household records in this castle for 19 years, Marin said flatly. "And wool merchants do not have calluses in that pattern, and they do not avoid the kitchen entirely, and they do not watch the king's movements." She paused. "I noted it. I had no proof of anything more." Ella sat down on the nearest crate without asking. "How long has this been happening?" "At least 2 years. Marin's voice was careful, controlled. "Possibly longer." 2 years. 2 years of a false merchant visiting the king's chief advisor. Ella thought about the alley in Dunmore. 3 hooded men, a blade, and the careful design of a distracted escort. "Has there been anyone else?" she asked. "Anything else that seemed wrong?" Marin's expression shifted. Something heavy moved through it. "The king's previous healer," she said slowly. "The fever that took him 3 weeks before you arrived." She paused. "I always thought it moved very fast, faster than fevers of that kind usually move." The chamber was very quiet. Ella felt the shape of something large and dark assembling itself in the space between what she knew and what she could prove. "I need you to trust me for a little longer," she said to Maren. "I need to be certain before I take this anywhere." Maren looked at her for a long moment. Then she said something that Ella did not expect. "I have been waiting for someone I could trust in this castle for 3 years." She straightened her posture and returned to her linen folding as if the conversation had been entirely ordinary. "Do not take too long." That evening, Ella sat at her writing desk with a candle burning low and a blank piece of parchment in front of her. She did not write anything on it. She simply sat and thought, methodically, the way she thought through a difficult diagnosis, laying out what she knew, what she suspected, and what she still needed. She knew. A man bearing the scar of one of Aiden's attackers had been seen speaking privately with Lord Cedric in the castle courtyard. She suspected the attack in Dunmore had not been opportunistic. It had been planned by someone with access to the king's travel route and schedule. She needed proof, enough to be believed, enough that she could go to Aiden with something real. The candle guttered. Outside her window, the wind moved through the courtyard, carrying the smell of coming snow. She thought about Maren's words. "I have been waiting for someone I could trust." She thought about Cedric's pale eyes in the great hall on her 3rd morning. "Welcome to Veyrath. I hope you find it instructive." She thought about a king who had ridden into a border village because he had not pretended to forget. She blew out the candle and sat in the dark for a long time. She was not afraid. She was something more complicated than afraid. She was the particular kind of alert that comes when you understand that the danger is real, and that you are, for the moment, the only one who sees its full shape. Tomorrow she would need to be very careful. And the day after that. And however many days it took until she had what she needed. She had been careful her whole life. She knew how to do this. The snow came overnight. By morning, Veyrath's courtyard was white and still. Every stone softened beneath a clean layer that muffled sound and turned the castle into something almost gentle. Ella stood at her narrow window for a long moment before dressing, watching the courtyard below, where 2 guards moved slowly through their rotation, their breath clouding in the cold air. She had spent 3 more days gathering what she needed. Maren had helped, quietly, without fanfare, with the precise competence of a woman who had been watching and waiting and filing things carefully away for years. Together, they had retrieved the gate records showing the false merchants' visits and cross-referenced them against the dates of every incident that had gone subtly wrong around the king in the past 2 years. A horse that had thrown Aiden unexpectedly on a northern road. A batch of wine at a formal dinner that had made him violently ill for 2 days, attributed at the time to poor storage. The healer whose fever had moved unnaturally fast. The pattern was clear and devastating. Lord Cedric Vane had been working methodically, patiently, across 2 years to remove the king. Not in one dramatic strike, but in slow erosion. Small incidents, plausible explanations. The attack in Dunmore had been the most direct attempt yet. Born, Ella suspected, of growing desperation. Of a plan that kept failing because Aiden was harder to kill than anticipated. She had laid it all out on her writing desk the night before in 2 columns. What she could prove and what she could not. The proven column was enough. Barely, but enough. She dressed, gathered the documents Maren had helped her compile, and went to find the king. She did not have to find him. He found her. She was halfway across the great hall when the doors at the far end opened and Aiden walked in. Not alone this time, but with 2 of his senior guards, and a step behind, Lord Cedric himself. Ella stopped walking. Cedric saw her at the same moment, and in the fraction of a second before his expression composed itself into its usual calibrated pleasantness, she saw it. A flash of something cold and calculating and deeply alert. He knew. Not what she had, perhaps, but that she was a problem he had underestimated. Aiden looked between them. She watched him read the room the way a man who has led armies learns to read rooms, in an instant, with complete attention. "Ella," he said, steady, even. "I need to speak with you," she said. "Now, privately." Cedric's voice came in smoothly before Aiden could respond. "The king has counsel in—" "Now," Ella said again. She looked only at Aiden. "Please." Something in his gray eyes sharpened. He turned to his guards. "Clear the hall," Cedric said with perfect composure. "Your Majesty, I really must insist." "You are included in the hall," Aiden said quietly. The silence that followed was very complete. Cedric's face remained still. But his hands, Ella noticed, his carefully ringed hands, which he always controlled so precisely, closed once, briefly, at his sides. Then he walked out with the guards, and the great hall doors closed, and it was only the two of them in the long room with the cold light coming through the high windows and the fire burning low at the far end. Ella set the documents on the table. She told him everything, plainly, in order, without drama, the way she would explain a diagnosis. The man in the courtyard and the scar she recognized, the gate records, the pattern of incidents, the healer's fever, the attack in Dunmore and what it meant about who had known his travel route. Aiden stood at the table and read what she had laid out. He did not interrupt her. He did not move much. When she finished, he was quiet for a long moment, his hand resting flat on the documents, his eyes on the table. "You have been building this for 3 days," he said. "I needed to be certain." "You went to Marin." She had been watching for longer than I had. She needed someone to tell. He looked up at her. His expression was not what she expected. Not anger, not the sharp cold of a king whose trust had been catastrophically violated. It was something more complicated. Something that looked, beneath the control of it, like a man who had just understood how close a thing had been, across 2 years, across every small incident he had attributed to misfortune. "He has been in my counsel for 11 years, he said, quietly. Not a defense of Cedric, a reckoning with himself. "I know," she said. "I trusted him. I know." He was silent again. Then, "You did not have to do this. You said the people of Veyrath matter to you." She held his gaze. "You are the people of Veyrath." Something moved across his face, broke through the control of it, briefly, like light through a crack in stone. He looked at her with those gray eyes and she looked back, and the distance between them felt different than it had in the alley, different than it had in every careful conversation since. Smaller and more honest, and weighted with everything that had passed between two people who had been quietly, steadily moving toward this moment without naming it. He reached out and covered her hand with his, where it rested on the edge of the table. Not dramatically. Simply. The warmth of it moved through her like the first real heat after a long cold. "Thank you," he said. She turned her hand and held his. Cedric was taken before the day was out. The false merchant, whose real name, under questioning, turned out to be Roth, a disgraced former beta lord from the western provinces, was apprehended at the city gate, attempting to leave. The evidence Ella and Marin had compiled held. Cedric, faced with it, did not deny anything. He stood before Aiden in the great hall with the particular, exhausted dignity of a man whose long game had finally ended, and he said with precise clarity that he had believed the king too soft for the territory, too unwilling to expand through force, too governed by principle. That Eldenmore deserved harder leadership, that he had been patient. Aiden listened to every word. Then he passed judgment in the measured, unsparing way of a man who had made peace with the weight of difficult decisions, and the matter was closed. Marin, that evening, sat in the healing chamber with Ella, and drank a cup of warm cider without speaking for a long time. Then she said, "Good," and went back to her work, and that was the full extent of her celebration. Ella thought it was the most satisfying single word she had ever heard. Winter turned in the slow way of northern winters, not quickly, not graciously, but with a kind of grinding honesty that eventually gave way to the first thin light of early spring coming through Ella's narrow window and landing warm on the stone floor. She had been in Veyrath for a full season. The morning her contract ended, she was in the healing chamber, organizing the herb shelf, properly organized now, by use and urgency, exactly as it should be, when Aiden appeared in the doorway. She looked at him. He looked at her. "Your season is finished," he said. "It is. Dunmore is 4 days' ride." "I know." He was quiet. He was holding something, a small object, which he set carefully on her work table. She looked down. It was a healer's seal, cast in silver, the kind issued by the crown to fully sanctioned royal healers, not apprentices. She looked up at him. "That is not a summons," he said, "and it is not a condition." He held her gaze with the complete, unhurried attention she had come to understand was simply how he looked at things he valued. "It is a recognition of what you already are." She picked up the seal. It was heavier than it looked, cool and solid in her palm. "And if I stay," she said carefully, "what would that be?" "A choice," he said, "freely made." She looked at the seal. She looked at him. She thought about the alley, the dark, the cold, the clay pot, and the gray eyes that had found her first the next morning. She thought about everything that had grown from that single moment of choosing not to walk away. The herb shelf. Marin's single satisfied word. The Lower Town children she had begun to know by name. The man in front of her, who had never once pretended she was less than she was. She set the seal down on the table, and then she smiled, the full, unguarded kind, the kind she rarely gave, because she had learned early that unguarded things could be used against you. She was beginning to unlearn that. "Then I choose to stay," she said. He exhaled, just barely, just once. And the carefully held stillness of him eased in a way she had not seen before, as if something long braced had finally been allowed to rest. He crossed the chamber in 3 steps, and when he took her hands in his, warm and certain and unhurried, Ella understood that this was not a beginning anymore. This was what remained after everything unnecessary had been stripped away. Just 2 people, honest with each other, in a room that smelled of lavender and beeswax and the first breath of spring coming through the window. It was enough. It was more than enough. It was everything. Marin retired the following autumn, on her own terms, with a letter of commendation from the king, and a cottage near the Lower Town that she had quietly arranged for herself 3 years prior. She visited the healing chambers every Tuesday, and claimed she was only checking the linen supply. Bram continued to talk to horses more gently than to people, and considered this entirely correct. Ren became Ella's first formal apprentice, with gap-toothed determination and quick hands that were already better than she knew. And Ella of Dunmore, fully sanctioned royal healer, the woman who had thrown a clay pot at an assassin and called it practical, remained in Veyrath, where she had chosen to be, for all the years that followed. She never did go back to reorganizing herb shelves she had already organized. She had better things to do with her hands.